On February 27, 2012, the quiet California suburb of Cameron Park in El Dorado County was shaken by an event that didn't fit the calm profile of this well-to-do neighborhood. At 10:30 in the morning, a call came into the rescue service from a local resident. The man reported that his neighbor, 44-year-old Todd Winkler, had come to him highly distressed and admitted that his wife was dead. According to the neighbor, Todd appeared agitated and claimed that a conflict with his wife had started in the early hours of the morning around 4 a.m. By the time of the call, the couple's 3 young children were already at the neighbor's house under supervision, suggesting that the father had had ample time to process what had happened before reaching out for help. When patrol officers arrived at the address, they saw Todd Winkler sitting on the steps of his front porch. The former military pilot had his hands clasped over his head, visibly overwhelmed with grief. But the very first exchange with officers introduced serious contradictions to the story. When asked if anyone was in the house, Todd initially said no, insisting the rooms were empty. But when an officer directly asked about the whereabouts of his wife, Rachel Winkler, the man abruptly changed his statement, saying she was dead and that her body was inside. As he was being detained, officers noticed fresh cuts and scrapes on the backs of Todd's hands. Even before entering the home, investigators were faced with the first falsehoods and the puzzling behavior of a man who had spent more than 6 hours near his wife's body before deciding to seek help. Insisting his actions were in self-defense, Todd claimed that Rachel had attacked him with scissors and that what followed was a tragic necessity. But this calm residential street was about to reveal a scene behind the doors of that home that would completely contradict every word of the widower hour. Leaving Todd Winkler in custody on the front lawn, officers entered the house. The first-floor hallway led them to a bedroom, the same room the husband had chosen for his final deadly act. On the floor, among personal belongings, lay 37-year-old Rachel Winkler, on her back. The level of aggressive behavior displayed was excessive, even for the most acute domestic conflict. The walls, carpet, and bed were splattered with blood. The primary wound was to the neck, severing the carotid artery and causing death almost instantly. Another deep-cut music was observed near the eye. Lying between the legs of the deceased were a pair of household scissors, the same implement Todd had described as the weapon of his wife's alleged attack. The most critical piece of evidence wasn't found on the victim's body. It was in the home's laundry room. There, investigators discovered a toddler's onesie with a distinct pattern of fine blood spatter. The nature of those stains told a chilling story. At the time of the attack, Rachel Winkler had been holding her youngest son in her arms. This fact alone shattered the husband's claim that Rachel had initiated the confrontation. She simply couldn't have attacked a trained military man while cradling a baby. Elsewhere in the home, despite the mild temperatures outside, the living room fireplace contained a layer of fresh ash. It would later be revealed that Todd Winkler had used the fire to burn blood-stained rags and towels, the very ones he had used in a methodical effort to wipe down the nursery floor, attempting to conceal the true nature of the struggle and the volume of blood loss. The 6 hours of so-called shock he referred to were in reality music spent coldly scrubbing the scene and staging a fake attack scenario. While one forensic team documented evidence in the nursery, another turned to the master bedroom. At first glance, the room appeared untouched, but it was here that the investigation made a discovery that turned what seemed like a domestic tragedy into something much more disturbing. Tucked beneath Todd Winkler's side of the bed, behind a nightstand, detectives found a small blue tin box. Inside was a grey powder, human ashes taken from a cremation urn. It was an ominous find. In a house where a second wife had just been found dead, the husband was storing the remains of his first wife. Records revealed the ashes belonged to Kathy Winkler, who had passed away 13 years earlier in September 1999. At the time, her death had been ruled an accident. She had burned alive in a car that went off a mountain road in rural Georgia. Todd had walked away from that crash without a single scratch, claiming he had been thrown from the bed of the pickup truck as it went over the edge. But now, with Rachel's body in the next room and Kathy's ashes hidden beneath the bed, investigators realized they weren't dealing with a grieving husband. They were looking at a man who had already outmaneuvered justice once before. The presence of Kathy's ashes in the home of his new wife didn't feel like a tribute. It felt like a chilling trophy, a token of control kept close. From that moment, the investigation took a new turn. music detectives in Cameron Park reached out to authorities in Georgia. When one of the lead investigators in Cleveland heard Todd Winkler's name, he asked just one question: who did he get this time? It became painfully clear that 13 years earlier, Todd had run the same playbook. He'd claimed that on the night of the accident he'd been bitten by some unknown animal or insect in the woods, which caused a severe allergic reaction. He said the swelling and shortness of breath made him unable to drive, so he put his wife behind the wheel. But now, with the ashes of his first wife beneath the bed of the second, that excuse was unraveling fast. Todd's twisted attachment to the souvenirs of his past had become the one fatal mistake that allowed police to connect both tragedies and turn them into a single sweeping charge. Investigators now had reason to believe that neither death was a music accident. They were part of a long-term plan orchestrated by a man who had mastered the art of deception. Todd Winkler had the kind of background that inspired immediate trust. A former elite U.S. Air Force fighter pilot who had served overseas in Japan and more recently a successful pharmaceutical sales rep. His high income allowed him to rent a second apartment in Alameda closer to his job, returning to Cameron Park only on weekends to be with his family. During questioning, Todd stated that his marriage to Rachel had long since lost its meaning. According to his account, in the early hours of February 27th, he walked into the master bedroom to talk about the future of their family, but was met with what he described as cold hostility. He claimed Rachel told him she didn't love him anymore and warned that if he ever tried to take the kids, her new partner, James White, would use force against him. Todd alleged that Rachel suddenly attacked him with a pair of kitchen scissors. He described a chaotic struggle in which he claimed he only tried to disarm her. A struggle, he said, resulted in cuts on his own hands. According to his version, the confrontation moved into the nursery, where he claimed he acted out of survival instinct in a kill-or-be-killed moment. But investigators quickly noted a glaring inconsistency. Todd Winkler, a professionally trained military man weighing over 220 lb, claimed he couldn't subdue a petite woman without using deadly force. The idea of a fair fight didn't align with his background or with the clear signs of a carefully staged self-defense scene crafted during the 6 hours he spent inside the house before reaching out to emergency responders. Todd's version of an unprovoked attack by an enraged wife required closer scrutiny, and the key figure in unraveling the story was the very person Todd had mentioned, James White, whom he named as Rachel's romantic partner. Unlike the reserved and calculated Todd, James showed no signs of concealment. When officers informed him of Rachel's death, he was visibly shaken. The depth of his reaction made a strong impression on detectives, and it soon became clear that his relationship with Rachel had been much more serious than a casual affair. James White worked in the maintenance department at the Cameron Park Airport. That's where 2 years before the tragedy, he had met Rachel. She had taken a job there as well, seeking financial independence from Todd. According to James, their relationship began about a year earlier. This wasn't a passing fling. The two were actively planning a life together. Not even Rachel's third pregnancy by Todd had stopped the bond from growing. To Rachel, James represented a way out, a path toward escaping what she saw as a stifling and emotionally cold marriage. The most important revelation James White shared was the timeline of Rachel's final hours. It turned out that on the evening before the incident Sunday, James had been helping her fill out divorce paperwork. This detail changed everything about how the morning of February 27th would later be understood. Monday was supposed to be the day Rachel would finally tell Todd she was leaving and hand him the documents for investigators. This was a powerful motive. The crime occurred at the exact moment Todd Winkler was about to lose control of his image, his perfect family, and his financial assets. James also offered a clearer look at Todd's character through stories Rachel had confided in him. She had described her husband as a pathological manipulator obsessed with control. When Todd left during the work week for Alameda, he would intentionally restrict her access to money, forcing her to ask, sometimes plead for even basic household expenses. But the most shocking revelation was Todd's willingness to engage in elaborate deception to gain sympathy or avoid responsibility. On one occasion, he faked having cancer. He shaved his head and eyebrows completely and used a special gel to mimic the effects of chemotherapy. According to Rachel, it was all part of an act, one that helped him evade work obligations and draw pity from others. These details painted the picture of a man capable of extreme deceit to get what he wanted. James White's testimony made it increasingly clear Rachel hadn't been the aggressor. She was a woman trying to break free from the grip of someone whose lies knew no bounds. The events from 13 years earlier, the ashes found beneath a bed in California, had originated on the opposite side of the country. In the early hours of September 26, 1999, at 3:19 a.m., emergency services in White County, Georgia, received a call about a large fire in a wooded mountainous area. First responders arrived to find a scene far beyond a routine car crash. A vehicle had veered off a winding mountain road, plunging nearly 30 ft into a deep ravine. The car was fully engulfed in flames which had already spread to the surrounding dry brush, destroying several hundred square ft of forest. The first witnesses were a pair of hikers camping nearby. They hadn't been woken by the sound of the crash, but by the flickering glow of flames and the sound of screaming. In the darkness, they found Todd Winkler pacing frantically near the edge of the cliff, shouting for his wife, Kathy. Just as it would happen years later with Rachel, the call to emergency services hadn't come from Todd himself. It came from others, and when police arrived, they immediately took note of Todd's physical condition. Although he claimed he'd been inside the vehicle when it went over the edge, 31-year-old Todd Winkler didn't have a single scratch, bruise, or trace of soot on his body. Todd Winkler's version of that night was just as bizarre as the statements he would later give in California. He claimed that while camping he was bitten by some type of insect or animal, which triggered an immediate allergic reaction. According to him, he began experiencing swelling and difficulty breathing. In a panic, 32-year-old Kathy Winkler supposedly placed him in the bed of their pickup truck so he could lie flat and breathe more easily. Then, racing down a dark, winding mountain road toward the hospital, Kathy lost control. The truck veered off a curve and plunged into a ravine. Todd said that during the fall, he was thrown from the open bed of the truck music and landed safely on the ground, while his wife, trapped in the cab, was unable to escape as the vehicle caught fire. But investigators in Georgia were immediately struck by the selective nature of his injuries. The man, who claimed to have been launched from a falling truck into rocks and trees, looked like he had just stepped out of his house. More concerning, despite the alleged life-threatening bite, he didn't need any medical attention. Doctors found no signs of bites, swelling, or allergic reaction. His breathing was normal. His speech was calm and coherent. Meanwhile, firefighters were battling intense flames to reach the charred remains of the vehicle. Inside, in a twisted position, were the remains of Kathy Winkler. The fire had burned with unusual intensity for a standard fuel tank explosion. Experts began to suspect the use of accelerants, though no direct evidence could be gathered at the scene that night. What did emerge from the autopsy would disturb even seasoned investigators. The forensic report confirmed that Kathy was alive when the truck went off the road and the fire started. Her lungs contained soot and carbon residue, a clear indication that she was breathing as the flames engulfed the vehicle. The cause of death was listed as thermal injuries. She had tragically been burned alive. Todd, however, stood above the ravine with no injuries, no burns, no cuts, not even a scrape. The way the fire spread also raised questions. While there were no obvious traces of gasoline outside the fuel system, the surrounding vegetation had burned far too quickly and thoroughly for a typical crash site. In the end, the incident was ruled an accident. But weeks later, the deeper motive began to surface. A request came into the Georgia Police Department from a life insurance company. It turned out that Todd and Kathy Winkler had taken out a policy for a substantial amount, $600,000. But what stood out was a clause that doubled the payout if death occurred in a motor vehicle incident. That accidental crash down a mountain road netted Todd Winkler over $1 million. After collecting the money, he left town immediately. He cut off all contact with Kathy's relatives and disappeared from the region entirely. Now, with a second wife dead under similarly suspicious circumstances and financial gain once again a clear factor, two stories, music, separated by more than a decade, and thousands of miles were finally being tied together, music, into one criminal case. On September 23, 2014, proceedings began in El Dorado County Superior Court in a case that quickly drew national attention. Seated at the defense table was Todd Winkler, a man whose carefully crafted image as a respectable businessman, music, had fully collapsed under the weight of the evidence. The defense strategy never changed. Todd's attorneys argued that Rachel Winkler had been the first to show aggression and that their client had acted only to save his own life. The prosecution, however, presented a carefully built case aimed at exposing Todd as a calculated and emotionally cold manipulator. A pivotal moment came when the judge ruled that the circumstances surrounding the death of Todd's first wife, Todd Winkler, could be introduced at trial. Although the court was formally focused on the events of 2012, the jury was allowed to see the broader pattern, the story of a man who had already once gained enormous financial benefit from the death of a spouse. Prosecutors dismantled the self-defense narrative. One of the first key points involved the biological analysis of a child's pajama top found in the laundry room. Todd claimed that after the fatal confrontation, he picked up his infant son, fed him with a bottle, and that the blood on the clothing belonged to Todd himself from cuts on his hands. Music laboratory testing proved otherwise. The bloodstains belonged exclusively to Rachel. This meant the attack occurred while Rachel was holding the baby. The blood pattern was consistent with impact spatter at the moment of the strikes, not secondary transfer from Todd's hands. This directly contradicted his account of a second struggle in which he claimed to be defending music himself. Instead, the evidence indicated Rachel had been caught off guard and was physically unable to mount any meaningful resistance while trying to protect her son. The final blow to Todd Winkler's credibility came from an analysis of his injuries. Music forensic experts testified about the unusual nature of the cuts on his hands. In genuine self-defense situations, wounds typically appear on the forearms, the backs of the hands, or the chest, areas people instinctively use to shield themselves. Todd's injuries, however, consisted of shallow, almost surgical-looking cuts on his palms and fingers. Investigators concluded these injuries were self-inflicted after the crime, designed to mimic signs of a struggle. When combined with his documented history of deception, including the staged cancer story and the false account of a fatal insect bite in 1999, the image of Todd Winkler before the jury shifted completely. He was no longer a man trapped by circumstance, but someone who repeatedly manipulated reality for financial control, treating human life as an obstacle rather than something sacred. On October 22, 2014, the trial over the crime against Rachel Winkler reached its conclusion. After weeks of testimony that laid out a disturbing portrait of the defendant's life and behavior, the jury was sent to deliberate. Despite the complexity of the case and evidence spanning 2 decades, the decision came with remarkable speed. After just 1 hour, the 12 jurors returned to the courtroom. In American courtrooms, such a swift verdict usually signals one thing: complete agreement and no doubt about the defendant's guilt. Todd Winkler was found guilty of first-degree murder. The court rejected any claims of self-defense, declaring his version of events to be entirely fabricated. The sentence followed soon after life in prison with the possibility of parole only after 26 years. For a man already 46 years old, the ruling effectively meant he would spend the majority of his remaining life behind the walls of a state correctional facility. The same calculating mind that had allowed him to deceive the system back in 1999 was no match this time for the hard scientific evidence and his own inability to stop before it was too late. Looking back, experts agree that it was the context of his past that played the defining role in securing the conviction. Had the judge not allowed the details surrounding Todd Winkler's death to be included in the trial, the defense might have been able to exploit the lack of direct eyewitnesses in the Cameron Park home. But the story of the deadly insect bite in Georgia and the massive insurance payout that followed, painted a clear picture for the jury of who Todd Winkler really was. There's a striking irony in this case. It was Todd's obsession with control and his fixation on keeping trophies that ultimately sealed his fate. The small blue tin containing the ashes of his first wife, hidden beneath the bed of the second, became the very link that tied the 2 tragedies together. If he had simply gotten rid of those remains, California investigators might never have had a reason to dig through cold records from another state. But Todd's pathological belief in his own invincibility and intellectual superiority was his undoing.